To enjoy this episode ad-free, please visit patreon.com/forensic tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
Imagine leaving your house for a normal day and simply never coming back. That's exactly what happened to Patricia Viola. When her husband returned home, Patricia was gone. She had left behind her purse, her keys, and all of her personal belongings. There was no note, no obvious sign of a struggle, and no clear explanation for where she had gone. In the months before her disappearance, Patricia had been dealing with significant stress and had hinted to a close friend that there was something important she needed to talk about. Then nearly a year later, a severed human foot washed ashore several miles away. Forensic testing confirmed it belonged to Patricia, but the rest of her remains were never found. More than 2 decades later, investigators still don't know exactly what happened to her. Did Patricia take her own life, or was she the victim of foul play? And how can forensic science help us discover the truth? This is Forensic Tales, episode 337, The Mysterious Disappearance of Patricia Viola. Welcome to Forensic Tales. I'm your host, Courtney Fretwell. Forensic Tales is a weekly true crime podcast with a forensic twist. Each episode features real stories highlighting how forensic science was used to uncover the truth. If you enjoy deep dives into real cases and the science behind them, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you want even more content, including monthly full-length bonus episodes and early ad-free access to over 300 episodes, you can join our community over on Patreon. The support there truly helps keep the show going. To learn more, visit patreon.com/forensic tales. And one small favor that makes a huge difference for the show: if you're enjoying Forensic Tales, please consider leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps other listeners discover the podcast. It was 4:30 in the afternoon on the day before Valentine's Day, February 13th, 2001, when 40-year-old Jim Viola arrived home from work and realized his wife was missing. He and 42-year-old Patricia, who went by Pat, and their 2 children, 13-year-old Christine and 10-year-old Michael, all lived together in Bogota, New Jersey, a small borough just a few miles from New York City. They had met while working at the same engineering firm and had been married for a little over 14 years by 2001. Jim was working as an electrical engineer, and Pat worked in human resources. But after they had their daughter, Christine, Pat decided to leave her job and become a full-time stay-at-home mom. That decision was truly her dream, and by all accounts, she was a very devoted mother. She never missed a school event with either kid. She always made sure the house was running smoothly, and she loved celebrating and making a big deal out of everyone's birthdays. But as Christine and Michael got a bit older, she found herself with a little extra time on her hands. So from about 1999 to 2001, she worked as a volunteer librarian at Michael's elementary school, which was only a few blocks away from the house, so she could be home quickly if she needed to be. But by the year 2000, Pat's life was starting to change. Like many of us go through during different chapters of our lives, she found herself getting buried under the weight and pressures of life. First, she had just started taking care of and visiting her mother-in-law, who had recently been hospitalized and was getting older. Because Jim had to be at the office every day, he wasn't able to care for her as Pat could. So that was just yet another responsibility for her. Second, she let her sister-in-law Donna move in with her, Jim, and the kids after a very bad breakup, telling her she could stay there as long as she needed to. The original plan was for her to stay a few weeks, maybe a month or two at the longest, until she got back on her own 2 feet. But as the months went by, it seemed like Donna wasn't making plans to move out anytime soon, and that seemed to weigh on Pat a little bit. It wasn't that Donna was a terrible person, but some of her living habits were getting under Pat's skin, especially her smoking habit. Not only was she a smoker, but she would often smoke in the guest bedroom where she was staying. But Pat reportedly never said anything to her sister-in-law about it. But it was definitely something bothering her. And can you really blame her? She had 2 young kids in the house, and every time Donna left, she would spend a really long time vacuuming, using air fresheners, doing whatever she could to get rid of the smoke smell. In fact, the day before Pat vanished, she discovered that Donna had burned a hole in the guest room bedspread, which understandably really upset her. It wasn't just because she would have had to buy a new bedspread, but it was also becoming a fire hazard. So she apparently spoke to Jim about it and said she planned on confronting her about the smoking in the house thing, but she never got the chance because they had a party to attend later that night. An event we'll get into much more detail about a little later in the episode. Finally, number 3, Pat had her own set of health problems she was dealing with. Ever since she was about 12 years old, she suffered from epilepsy and seizures and regularly took 2 different kinds of medication to control them. And in November of 2000, just 3 months before she disappeared, she suffered a generalized tonic-clonic seizure that landed her in the hospital. These types of seizures can be pretty bad because they can sometimes cause a person to fall down or cause loss of consciousness. It also left her unable to drive because after the seizure, the doctor suspended her driver's license for the next 3 months. Pat was actually supposed to get her license back the same month she disappeared, in February 2001, as long as her doctor signed off on it, saying she was healthy enough to drive again. Having her behind the wheel, on the road with other cars, was just a really risky thing because she could have a seizure at any moment. But on February 6th, just 1 week earlier, the doctor extended the suspension for another 3 months, which would have been very disappointing for her. Pat must have been really excited about being able to drive again. It was also really stressful for her because one of her favorite holidays was Christmas, and without a driver's license, she wasn't really able to do the kind of gift shopping she liked to. It also made it impossible to drive the kids around. So at the time of her disappearance, she had a lot of things going on, and many of them were completely out of her control. She's caring for her sick mother-in-law on top of watching her own 2 kids. She's bottling up her issues with her sister-in-law about the smoking habit, and she's still not able to drive and live a totally normal life and a free life because of her own health issues. While all of these stressors may seem unrelated, they help paint a picture of where Pat was emotionally in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She wasn't necessarily in crisis, but she was carrying a lot on her shoulders. And on the afternoon of February 13th, all of those worries suddenly became secondary when Jim walked through the front door and realized Pat was nowhere to be found. That afternoon, Jim got home from work a little earlier than he normally would have. He had actually stopped at the store to buy a Valentine's Day gift for Pat, but when he walked inside, he instantly felt like something was off. There was no sign of her, and the house's alarm system was going off like someone had activated it, which was strange because Pat should have been home. Every day when Jim got off work, Pat was there to greet him at the front door. Although he was home a little earlier than usual, it wasn't by more than an hour or so. So the first thing he did was go to the alarm panel and turn it off before the cops were notified. And in case you're wondering, the Viola family wasn't the kind of people to activate their alarm system if they were home. It would only be on if they were out and about somewhere. So right away, Jim knew Pat had left the house for some reason without giving him a heads up first. To some people, that wouldn't sound strange at all. She's a grown woman and can leave the house whenever she wants to without telling her husband. But for someone like Pat, that was completely out of character. Throughout their entire marriage, she had always stuck to a schedule. So her not being home was really weird. But Jim didn't jump to any conclusions. He wasn't the kind of guy to assume the worst possible case scenario. Not yet, anyway. After turning the security alarm off, he turned around to put his work bag down, but noticed the key that permanently lived in the keyhole of their back door was now lying on the kitchen table. Another red flag that something isn't right. He also noticed the hallway where Pat usually kept her jacket and purse. The purse was there, including her wallet, keys, and phone, but the jacket was gone. But probably the most disturbing thing left behind in her purse was her epilepsy medication. Both bottles were still inside, and she was supposed to take one of them at 5 o'clock that evening. So wherever she was, she didn't have her seizure medication with her. But where would she have gone without it? Jim spent the next couple of hours still trying not to jump to the worst case scenario. He knew his wife was an adult, and if she wanted to leave the house for a few hours without telling anyone, that was her prerogative. But as the hours ticked by, he only got more and more worried about her. She had already missed taking her medication and didn't even have her purse with her. So he started by calling around to their friends and neighbors, but no one had heard from her that afternoon. He also drove around the community, thinking maybe she had gone for a walk and had a seizure somewhere. That would have been one of the most likely scenarios. Maybe she decided to take a walk and get some fresh air. She had a seizure unexpectedly and was now lying in a park somewhere unconscious, needing help. But he didn't see her anywhere in the neighborhood. By 11:58 that night, Jim decided it was time to pick up the phone and call the police to report her missing. Normally, there would be a 48 to 72-hour waiting period, but this case was different. Pat wasn't your typical adult because she was without her epilepsy medication. So she was listed as a high-risk missing person. But since the call didn't come in until close to midnight, there wasn't an official search until the following morning. By Valentine's Day morning, the police got their hands on the home's security alarm system data, showing Pat had activated the alarm at 8:30 the morning before. This was pretty typical because Jim was usually the first person out the door, followed by the kids to school, and then Pat would usually leave last and set the alarm. They were also able to verify that she made it to the library where she worked as a volunteer librarian. It was only a couple of blocks away, so she could easily walk there in the mornings. When detectives spoke with some of the other library employees, none of them said anything unusual. Pat seemed completely fine that morning, so no one had any reason to worry about her. They said she might have been a little quieter than usual, but it wasn't a big deal. At 11:30, Pat left the library like she usually did and presumably started her walk home. A mailman even waved to her sometime around 11:40. But after that, the timeline gets a little fuzzy, and here's why. When the police searched the home, they found a message on the family's answering machine from the morning of the 13th, left by Pat's mom. And in the message, her mom said the security company had called her to ask if everything was okay at the house because their home alarm had been tripped. They'd apparently tried to call Jim at work, but he didn't pick up. And even though Pat had her phone with her, she usually turned it off while at the library. So when they couldn't reach either one of them, they went to Pat's mom, who was the emergency contact. The security company also contacted the police, who sent an officer out to the house to check on it. But when the officer got there was nothing out of the ordinary. No windows had been broken, the door was locked. Everything seemed completely fine, so he left. And the alarm company put it down as an error or an electrical problem. But could there actually have been someone inside the home that the cop didn't see? Could they have gotten inside without breaking a window or busting a lock? Unfortunately, we don't know because all the officer did was a simple walk around. So if someone was inside the house who shouldn't be, we have no idea. Based on phone records and a conversation with Pat's mom, we know she called her mom back at 12:30. And from everything her mom said, the call was completely normal. She said her daughter sounded like she always did. But some people speculate that someone might have forced Pat to call her mom to reassure her that everything was fine. If someone had in fact broken into the house and lain in wait until Pat got back from the library, they would need to do something about the alarm. But that's just one of many possible theories tied to this story. And I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole about anything without concrete evidence. All we know is that Pat called her mom back about the alarm and said everything was fine. Then the last thing we know is that she reset the alarm at 1:11 that afternoon. To better understand what might have happened to her, we have to go back to the night before. That night, she and Jim went to a party at Pat's best friend's house. The party was the reason why she didn't have time to talk to her sister-in-law about the cigarette burn on the bed. And while they were there, Pat shared something with her best friend that would take on a much greater significance after she disappeared. She told police that as soon as Pat walked in through the front door, she sensed something was off about her. She was dressed nicely and wearing makeup, but there was just something not right about her. They had been friends for years, and she knew her better than anyone else. But before she could say anything, Pat pulled her aside and said they needed to talk. According to Toinette, as soon as they walked into another room, away from everyone else at the party, Pat immediately broke down in tears. But as much as Toinette pressed for details about what was wrong, she wouldn't get into specifics. She just said she was really stressed and would tell her everything if they could get away together for a few days. She even asked Toinette to cancel an upcoming vacation she had planned. That's just how desperate she was to get whatever was bothering her off her chest. But the most concerning thing was what she said next. She told Toinette she wanted her to look after her kids, no matter what. But she didn't go into any more detail other than that. And because Pat was so upset, her best friend didn't want to push her too much. She just gave her a hug and promised her the kids would be fine. But that's one of the biggest unanswered questions in this entire case. What was it that Pat wanted to get off her chest so badly? Was it something minor, something personal, or something that could explain what happened next? We'll likely never know because Pat disappeared the very next day. When detectives canvassed the neighborhood, they found very little to work with. None of Pat and Jim's neighbors recalled seeing anything suspicious that day. No strange vehicles, no screams, no signs of a struggle. If someone had approached or abducted Pat, no one appeared to have witnessed it. Investigators also took a hard look at Jim. As Pat's husband, he was naturally one of the first people they scrutinized. Detectives spent hours interviewing him, examining his movements, and looking for any inconsistencies in his story. Jim even agreed to take a polygraph examination. But the more investigators looked into him, the less suspicious he appeared. His whereabouts that day were corroborated, and police found no evidence linking him to Pat's disappearance. Before long, their attention shifted elsewhere. No one could ignore the other possibility. Pat may have taken her own life and committed suicide, but there isn't much evidence of that either. She didn't leave behind a note, and, according to her loved ones, that's not something they believed she would have done. She was obviously under a lot of stress, but she also had a lot of things she was excited about and looking forward to. For instance, the couple had recently purchased a timeshare in Pennsylvania and hadn't even had the chance to visit the property yet. They were already talking about future trips and making plans as a family. And by all accounts, Pat was incredibly devoted to her children. The thought of her voluntarily disappearing and leaving them behind was difficult for many who knew her to reconcile with. Of course, people struggling emotionally don't always show it, and investigators couldn't completely rule out the possibility. But for those closest to Pat, the suicide theory never seemed to fully fit the woman they knew. For the next several weeks, the police continued to search for any sign of Pat, but nothing ever turned up. She quite literally vanished into thin air without taking anything with her. Her purse, medication, everything was still back at the house, and if she committed suicide, then where was her body? There was also the theory that maybe she suffered a seizure somewhere and was hurt. But just like with the suicide theory, they should have been able to find her. Remember, Pat wasn't driving at the time because her license had been suspended. If she left the house that day, she likely did so on foot, which raises an important question. How does someone disappear so completely when they couldn't have gotten very far on their own? Over the next several weeks, tips and leads trickled in, including one from a man who said he thought he saw Pat all the way in Pennsylvania, near the area where they had just purchased that timeshare. On the surface, this makes sense. They had just gotten the property, so maybe she went there to spend a little time alone and get away from the things that were bothering her. But when the police went out and investigated the tip, it didn't lead anywhere. Plus, how would she have gotten there without her purse and no driver's license? There's no way she ended up in a different state with nothing but her jacket and the clothes she wore that day. The next major tip didn't come until about a year later, when an anonymous mail caller called the police, saying he was the one who killed Pat. His exact words were, "I killed the old girl." Initially, investigators took the threat seriously and spent time trying to identify the caller. But as they dug deeper, they discovered the man had absolutely no connection to Pat's disappearance. The call turned out to be a hoax, made by a disgruntled ex-boyfriend in an unrelated domestic dispute. Then after that, the case went quiet again. With no other direction to go, the family eventually hired a private investigator. And one tip they uncovered involved a shocking crime that had occurred directly across the street from the Viola home just a few years earlier. A triple homicide tied to a robbery. So some people wondered if Pat had somehow been targeted because of a connection to that case. But when the police looked into this theory, they found no evidence linking Pat's disappearance to the murders, and the lead ultimately went nowhere. And the case was once again ice cold. As the years went on, Jim and the rest of the family did their best to keep her story in the media and held out hope for a happy ending. Jim also became very involved in legislation regarding missing persons. And in 2008, he collaborated with government officials and other loved ones of missing individuals in New Jersey to pass Patricia's Law. This law essentially requires police to accept every missing persons report, regardless of the circumstances, inform the family of available support services, and, if the missing person is not found within 30 days, collect DNA samples and enter them into a national database. This was a major step forward from an investigative standpoint. DNA can be one of the most powerful tools available in a missing persons case, allowing investigators to identify unidentified remains years or even decades after a person disappears. And in Pat's case, DNA would ultimately provide the family with one of the only concrete answers they would ever receive. In September 2012, 11 years after Pat disappeared, the police got a very unexpected phone call from the Center for Human Identification at the University of North Texas. And what they had to say would completely change the ending to this story. They told police that human remains, specifically a left foot, had washed ashore in 2002, about a year after Pat's disappearance. And now, thanks to advancements in DNA testing, those remains have been positively identified as belonging to Pat Viola. Here's the full story. On July 27, 2002, a bone fragment from a human left foot was discovered by a man walking on a beach in Queens, New York. He said he found it next to a sock and a white shoe that matched the ones Pat had been wearing the day she disappeared. And although the bone was found all the way back in 2002, DNA wasn't extracted from it until 2005. It took 3 long years because apparently the medical examiner's office was completely overwhelmed by the aftermath of 9/11. So the foot bone just wasn't a very high priority. And by 2012, the office still had over 21,000 unidentified remains and more than 1,000 people who had not been positively identified. So it was just a very, very slow forensic process. But once the DNA was finally extracted, it was sent to the University of North Texas for analysis. And that's when they were able to determine that the foot belonged to Pat. But unfortunately, that was the only piece of her that has ever been found. Besides her left foot, none of her other remains have been discovered yet. Or, if they have, no one's been able to link them back to her. And from a forensic perspective, that's a complete nightmare, because one single foot bone can't possibly tell us what happened to her or how she died. What DNA could do was answer one very important question. Was Pat still alive? And sadly, the answer was no. But beyond that, the evidence was incredibly limited. Investigators couldn't determine the cause of death. They couldn't determine a manner of death. They couldn't tell whether she had been murdered, died by suicide, or suffered some sort of accident. And that's because forensic pathologists rely on the rest of the body to tell the story. They're looking for injuries, trauma, signs of disease, evidence of drowning, toxicology findings, or anything else that might explain how a person died. But with only a small portion of a foot available for examination, there simply wasn't enough evidence to reconstruct what happened during Pat's final moments. So while the DNA identification finally gave the family confirmation that the remains belonged to Pat, it also created a frustrating new reality. They were no closer to understanding how she got there. That particular beach is about 5.5 miles long and leads directly to the Atlantic Ocean. So it's virtually impossible to determine where or how her body could have entered the water. And when the bone was first discovered, the police searched the area extensively, both on land and by helicopter, but nothing else turned up. Even all of these years later, the rest of Pat's remains haven't surfaced. When Pat's foot was first identified, the family wasn't able to hold a funeral right away. That's because Pat's son, who was now 21 years old, was in a medically induced coma, healing from a very bad infection. So they had to wait until he was better enough and released from the hospital so they could finally lay her to rest. And when they did, Jim carried a small white container, carrying what little remains authorities were able to find of his wife, into St. Joseph's Church. She was then later buried in Hackensack Cemetery. According to the police, Pat's case is still open, and they will investigate any new leads as they come in. But after more than 2 decades, her family is still searching for answers, and the list of possibilities seems endless. The first theory is one the police considered very early on. Pat became the victim of foul play. Whether it was connected to the alarm system or not, no one knows. But many people wonder if she could have become a victim sometime after leaving the library around 11:30 that morning. We know she talked to her mom on the phone and said everything was fine, but what if someone forced her to make that call? The same person who tripped the alarm in the first place? Or something could have happened to her after she spoke to her mom on the phone. That theory explains why she didn't take anything with her. If someone broke into the house, they weren't going to let her grab her purse or seizure medication. They would have left the house in a hurry. And remember the key that was always in the back door lock, but was found on the kitchen table? Some people wonder if that might be an important clue. But the theory doesn't explain why she took her coat, which was missing from the hallway. It also doesn't tell us who the suspect could be. I found nothing in Pat's background or personal life suggesting she had enemies or anyone who would want to hurt her. There's also zero evidence suggesting her husband, Jim, had anything to do with it. He was at work all day and passed a polygraph. Plus, her 2 children were young at the time and at school. So as far as suspects go, there aren't any. If foul play was involved, it seems likely it involved a total and complete stranger. Someone who knew Pat was home alone or coming home very shortly. But there's also the theory that she might have walked in on a robbery. This goes back to the house security system. Maybe she encountered burglars after returning home from work. They took her hostage because they didn't want any witnesses who could identify them. Then they killed her and disposed of her body somewhere. But foul play certainly isn't the only possible explanation. The second most likely involved suicide. People who think she may have taken her own life point to what she told her best friend the night before she disappeared. Pat asked her to always look after her 2 children. She also wanted her to cancel her upcoming vacation, so maybe she wanted her around to help with the kids while Jim would have been busy dealing with her death. So maybe she was having thoughts about ending her life. We also know she was under a lot of stress. One local paper, the Cliffview Pilot, reported that she had committed suicide by jumping into the Hudson River, floating under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and then to the shore of Rockaway. But the police say that's merely a guess. There's zero evidence suggesting she jumped off any bridge. Another theory I came across was that she could have been having an affair, and the stress stemmed from her fear of being caught. But I don't want to spend too much time on that because there's literally no evidence she was having an affair. That theory stems from pure speculation, and I want to stay away from that. Finally, there is the possibility that she suffered a seizure after leaving the library or after returning home. We know she had a long history of epilepsy and had experienced a serious seizure just months earlier. If she became disoriented, wandered away, or somehow entered the water, it could explain why there was never evidence of a struggle or obvious foul play. So at the end of the day, this could have just been a terrible, terrible accident or medical emergency. But like every other theory in this case, it raises just as many questions as it answers. If that happened, where are the rest of her remains? And how did she travel so far from home without anyone noticing? If you were to ask Pat's own family, I don't think they have a theory they lean toward. Here's what Jim said in a CBS News article about that. For anybody, even the local police, to come up with a theory of what happened, It's crazy because the evidence is not there to show anything, he said. And that's what makes Patricia Viola's case so frustrating. More than 2 decades later, we still don't know whether Pat was murdered, took her own life, or suffered some sort of medical emergency. Every theory seems possible, and every theory seems to have at least one major problem. From a forensic standpoint, this case is especially heartbreaking because the science actually worked. The DNA did exactly what it was supposed to do. It identified the remains. It confirmed that the foot found on a beach in Queens belonged to Pat. It gave her family one answer they had spent more than a decade searching for, but it couldn't answer the questions that mattered most. How did she die? Where did she die? And what happened between 1:11 that afternoon when she reset her home's alarm system and the moment her remains somehow entered the water? Those answers may have been lost forever. Today, Patricia Viola's case remains open. Her family continues to hope that someone, somewhere, knows something they haven't come forward with. Because despite all the theories, all the searches, and all the years that have passed, one thing remains certain. A devoted mother walked home from work on an ordinary February afternoon and seemingly vanished without a trace. And aside from a single foot bone recovered more than a year later, Patricia Viola has never been found. If you have any information regarding her disappearance, please contact the Bogota Police Department or the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office. To share your thoughts on this week's episode or to share your theories about what happened to Pat, be sure to follow us on social media at Forensic Tales. And if you want to listen to new episodes early and ad-free, consider signing up for our Patreon at patreon.com/forensictales. You can get early ad-free access to new episodes and monthly full-length bonus episodes for as little as $3 a month. Your support on Patreon directly helps to fund the show's production, research, and editing costs. And as an independent, one-woman podcast, your support truly helps to keep this show going. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to support the show and help fund research, production, and editing, you can do so with a small monthly contribution on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive bonus content. You can learn more at patreon.com/forensictales. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a positive rating or review really helps others discover it. For a full list of sources used in this episode, visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.